It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back in to another podcast by George. Well, this is a follow-up to an earlier podcast. It was a sad day for me. I'm still somewhat sad about it. The brother of my best friend in life died recently, and he was a victim of PTSD. Now, that's not what killed him, but it afflicted him his entire life since his service in Vietnam. And I'm talking about Gary Alexander. He was in this book that's just off my left side here, War on the Rivers, written by Wymus Sims. We talked about that earlier. And Gary struggled with that. He fought bravely his entire life, but it bothered him. It was an issue until the day he died. And I got to tell you, I was somewhat surprised to find that out. I would talk to my buddy, ask him about his brother, who was also a very close friend of mine, how he was doing. And he would always bring that up. And I'm like, my God, doesn't that wear off? Doesn't it lessen in severity? Is it getting worse? How, after all of these years, all of these decades, can he be suffering from that affliction? But that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about it with Matthew Ho. He's got 12 years experience with America's wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan. I like that, with the State Department over the American escalation of that war. And prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq. First in 2004-05 in Salah ad-Din province with the State Department Reconstruction and Governance Team, and then in 2006-2007 in Anbar province as a Marine Corps company commander. I'm going to keep reading this because this is all good stuff. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. His writings have appeared in online and print periodicals such as the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Defense News, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. He's been a guest on hundreds of news programs. You've probably seen him. I know I have. He's been on BBC, CBS, CNN, C-SPAN, Fox, NBC, MSNBC, NPR, and Pacifica, and RT. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations has cited Matthew's resignation letter from his post in Afghanistan as an essential document. In 2010, Matthew was named to the Ridenhour Prize recipient for truth-telling. Again, I love that stuff. And he's a member of the board of directors for the Institute for Public Accuracy, an advisory board member for Exposed Facts, North Carolina Committee to Investigate Torture, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War. And he's an associate member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanities. He's a 100% disabled veteran, unfortunately, and has been certified by North Carolina as a peer support specialist for mental health and substance use disorder. Well, it's a long bio, but it's well deserved. And Matthew Ho, welcome on into a podcast by George.
Thanks, George, for having me on. And I need to remember to send my short bio to people. But I appreciate you having me here and taking the time to read all that. Thank you.
Well, and I do that for all of my guests. And the way that I put it to people is when you get to be my age, really, a lot of times, most of what you have left is a bio, and that's a good one, pal. Well, to go back to where I started, when you hear me talk about my friend that way, what comes to mind?
Well, first I want to, say, and we talked before the show, and I just want to reiterate, I'm sorry he passed. It's the idea, and as you were discussing, it never ends. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about PTSD. There's a lot of misconceptions about the invisible wounds of war. And one of them is that it's equatable to, things that happen in normal life, or it's equatable to other emotional issues that, come and go over time. So, all of us have had broken hearts. All of us have been let down, say, by, a man or a woman. And, that pain can be debilitating, but it lessens over time. And then at some point you say to yourself, what did I ever see in her? Right. Or what have I ever seen in him? And it's not the case with PTSD. We know from studies, we know from research, that PTSD stays with a person for their whole life. Now, it's something that can be managed. And it's something that can be, the symptoms can be lessened or abated, but certainly it doesn't ever go away. And so if your symptoms are a point where that they're barely noticeable, if you stop doing all those things that you're doing to keep those symptoms at a minimum or barely visible, it's going to flower back up again. And I mean, one of the things that I like to tell people, for people to get an idea of how serious it is that there's been studies done where they've put soldiers into MRI machines before they've gone to, say, Afghanistan. And then when they come back, they put them back into the MRI machine, and they're looking at the brain. And during, the brain has changed in size and shape because of that combat deployment. That the stress of the PTSD, what happens with PTSD is basically your body is reacting to a survival event. You've been in a life-threatening situation, and so your limbic system, which is what regulates your survival chemicals, the cortisol and adrenaline and other things, that doesn't get turned off. It's almost like the valve is stuck open, and so it keeps pumping all those survival chemicals into you. And that's why people relive the events. That's why they have nightmares. That's why they are hypervigilant. They can't sit without their back being to the wall, right? They get startled easily. And then that rolls into irritability, into depression, into substance use disorder, into anger issues. And then that, of course, becomes relationship issues, workplace issues, and eventually it can lead to suicide, along with, a host of other mental health issues. But so what happens particularly too for, say, combat veterans, and I should say PTSD is not limited to veterans. PTSD occurs to anyone who's had a life-threatening event. But you have what's also called complex PTSD. That's where you've had multiple issues compounded. And you see that in people who, say, grew up in abusive homes, right? You see that in people who maybe, say, refugees. You see that in combat veterans. So, for someone like your friend Gary, who spent a year in Vietnam, every day, him and his crewmates on that small little boat, and if you haven't watched the podcast that George did with the author of that book, Weymouth, it's a really great podcast. And there's some photos in that, it gives you an understanding of what that might have been like. But, he goes out every day and he hunts for people, and other people are hunting for him. And so what happens is our survival system was not meant to be turned on for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's meant for only because, it evolves with us, right? So the saber-toothed tiger comes into our cave, right? It's was meant for situations like that, not for being used every day. And so basically, in layman's terms, it's stuck on. And all those chemicals are continuing to pump in his body, even though he's back home in the United States. And then, like I said, that kind of spirals into other issues, other mental health problems, leads to, right? And then that leads to homelessness, that leads to domestic violence, that leads to, of course, suicide, that leads to unemployability. I mean, so many veterans are unemployable just because they can't handle the stress. It's funny because you go into combat and you perform well, and then you come home and you knock over a glass of water in your kitchen and it's like the world is ending. It's a very because you're in this heightened state of survival, and so everything becomes not just a big deal but a life or death issue.
It reminds me of a buddy of mine, another buddy actually, that came back from Vietnam, was in a Kmart with him. Somebody knocked something off the shelf. The dude hit the deck. I mean, right there in the middle of Kmart. I mean, he hadn't. That shows you how present it was in his mind. Well, now before I reached out to you, Matthew, I talked to Gary's brother and his wife, Pat, and because I wanted to see if there was something in particular they wanted me to ask you about. And his brother wanted to know, in your instance, when did this first manifest itself, and when did you first become aware of it?
I first became aware of it after coming home from my first time in Iraq, and I was staying with my parents, and it was I heard some fireworks, and I was laying in bed, and I became very tense, very concerned. Um, I didn't like it. I felt I should be doing something about it, right? I felt like I should be, getting into a bunker or grabbing a rifle or doing whatever. And that was the first instance of it. And then after that time, that first time in Iraq, it was. It became more noticeable with the hypervigilance, the hyper awareness, that startle reflex, like you talk about. So in Iraq, we dealt with IEDs, improvised explosive devices, roadside bombs. So you go and you're driving on, I-40 in North Carolina, and you pass something on the side of the road, and your entire body tenses up. You're waiting for it to explode, or your body's waiting for it to explode, even though you're just driving towards Greensboro, right? So it was that. And then, we'd be with my girlfriend, and, she would be upset because I couldn't look at her. We'd be in a restaurant, and I'd be looking at everybody else, right? Checking out everything. So it was that kind of stuff. It didn't devolve into the suicidality until after my second deployment. And that's where the moral injury really raised its head. This idea that I had transgressed my own moral values, that I had, done things that were abhorrent to who I thought I was a person, or took part in things that were abhorrent. I transgressed in that way. I let myself down, I let others down, etc. And that's when the suicidality began.
That phrase that you use is key, moral injury. And I wanted to ask you about that in maybe a slightly different angle, but my feeling has always been that the major religions, the Christian Bible, for instance, thou shalt not kill, that's prevalent in all religions. And, it's a good thing, it's a meritorious thing, and it's a fundamental of but maybe more than that. To me, it's always struck me as one of the essence of life, really. I remember reading one time Carl Jung. He's this sidecar guy to Sigmund Freud. He was a devotee of his. I think he was like an assistant or something like that. But he always said there are certain things in the human being that don't have to be taught. They're intrinsic to the human persona. You don't have to teach somebody to be afraid of a snake. They don't. If they've never seen one, they're terrified of it. Fire and lightning and all of these things that can take you out and kill you. You don't have to be taught those things. Well, this moral injury thing, do you think is that intrinsic to the human nature?
I think it is. And when you brought up Jung, I thought of the archetypes, right? How people tend, and I can't remember how many he stated there were, but people tend to be certain archetypes. People tend to be certain personas, I guess. And I think it is. I think it is intrinsic. And then, of course, we're taught it. We're taught it through morality tales, whether it's, you're in Sunday school, whether it's because you're watching Batman and Robin, you're taught about being the good guy. You're taught about being the person with the white hat on. And then you get put in a situation where and moral injury can occur again. And it's different than PTSD. It's not PTSD per se. It's a separate thing. And the VA and the American Medical Association and Psychiatric Association, they're starting to evolve their thinking on this to classify it separately. These issues of really with moral injury, you're dealing with issues of guilt, shame, regret. And so it can happen to a lot of people. It can happen to anyone who, again, transgresses. And it doesn't have to be that you did something. It could be that you failed to do something, right? So you see this. I just was watching a news story a couple months ago about whether, the epidemic of suicide among doctors, right? That doctors have a very high suicide rate. So do police officers. And does that come down to the fact that they have failed morally? Listening to the podcast with Weymouth, the gentleman who wrote the book you're talking about the swift boats in Vietnam, and he said that particularly in the beginning of the war, more guys died from drowning than from combat. Well, you can have moral injury because your buddy falls overboard and you don't save him. And then you deal with that the rest of your life, because in your mind, up until that instance, you thought you would be the guy who would save somebody, right? And I had exactly that instance. I suffer from lots of episodes of moral injury. I think most guys and gals who've been in war, or, if you're a doctor, and how many people have died on your operating table, right? I mean, so maybe you deal with one of those issues successfully through therapy, and then it's just like peeling the onion in the next issue. But the first instance of moral injury for me was I was in a helicopter accident. We had to make a water landing. We had to abandon the helicopter, and one of my friends died. And I swam for my life. I didn't save him, and about 9 months after the fact, it hit me, right? It hit me that I didn't save him. And I had to go and speak to his family and his kids and everything. And, and there was no way I could have saved him. I had all my combat gear on, right? I had 180 rounds of rifle ammunition, 90 of pistol or 45 of pistol, had all kinds of stuff on me, my body armor, my bulletproof plates of ceramic plates we wear. I was just lucky to survive myself. 4 guys died. And, so that was this issue of moral injury, was the fact that in my mind leading up to that moment, I had always envisioned in a circumstance like that, I would have saved somebody, and I didn't. And, and you can't deal with that rationally or reasonably or intellectually. I know if I had tried to help somebody, I would have gone under too, so, this issue of moral injury, it is quite a great distressor. I mean, it is worse than, so I also have traumatic brain injury, and that's why I'm 100% disabled. And I deal with migraines constantly that last anywhere from 3 hours to 18 hours. I have problems with cognitive thinking. I have exhaustion issues, etc. And even when it's the worst pain I have, I would prefer that over the moral injury any day. Because that distress, that psychic distress, that existentialist stress, that you've transgressed. I can't emphasize that enough. Is so much that's what makes so many combat veterans want to kill themselves, and we know this from studies. We know this as early as 1991. The VA had a study that said, the best predictor of suicide in Vietnam combat veterans was combat-related guilt. And since then, nearly every study that I know of, including studies done overseas of people who took part in the Balkans or of, say, in Israel, as well as anecdotal information we have from Soviet soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, even from Vietnam, even from the Vietnamese, so you think of a war like, say, Vietnam, if you're part of the North Vietnamese and you could say to yourself, look, we liberated our country, they still suffer because that act of killing is something we're taught, particularly when it's done not in a sense, not in a manner that is in any way protective, in any way defensive, and it's something that also, too, when you've had things stacked on top of that, you're going over to Iraq to keep us safe from another 9/11 or to find WMD, or to liberate the people. And the people we put in charge are just as bad as the guy we took out. That type of being lied to is also another form of moral injury, that you've been betrayed. And then finally, the other form of moral injury that affects so many veterans is among both male and female veterans. But, in the United States military, the rate of sexual assault, sexual abuse, rape is extremely high. For women, during their enlistment, which is 3.5, 4 years for most of them, they have between a 1 in 4 and a 1 in 3 chance of being raped or sexually assaulted. And so when that happens to you when that's done to you by a superior, which is often the case, this idea of being betrayed because you've been taught, you've been conditioned that you're all on the same team, you take care of one another, and then that happens to you, and then there's no avenue for justice as well. That's another form of moral injury, and I think that's why you see such an elevated rate of suicide in women veterans in addition to the combat.
Wow, and I knew we would run out of time, and I've still got a little time. I want to ask a couple of questions, some things Sure. I've seen you say that are truly amazing to me. One of them is we have more victims of PTSD and suicide from the Iraq-Afghanistan war than combat there itself. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. We have The VA estimates, there's been 7,300 U.S. service members killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. The VA estimates about 10,000 veterans have killed from those wars have killed themselves. So just on that number alone, and of course, as most people understand, with suicides is undercounting, right? I was just looking at a chart the other day that showed the number of deaths by veterans, and motorcycle, unintentional poisoning, car crashes, they're all higher than the civilian population.
Drinking,
right? Drinking, exactly. And also too, how do you know if a veteran is going 120 miles an hour on his motorcycle and crashes into his tree, you'll never know whether he did that on purpose, right? So suicides, as everyone knows, is an undercounting. And so the rate for veterans of the wars, is 4 to 10 times higher than it is for civilians. So if you, and that depends upon your age range. So if you're a young man or woman who went to war in Iraq or Afghanistan, you have a rate of suicide 4 to 10 times higher than someone of your same sex and age. And that translates into about 2 veterans of the Iraq and Afghan war a day kill themselves or killed by suicide. And, you multiply that times 365, and you can understand how the rate of suicide or the numbers of suicide are greater than those killed in combat. I also want to say that it's just not particular to the Iraq and Afghan wars. We know this for Vietnam, and the assumption is for World War II as well. We don't really have much data on previous wars. Everything is anecdotal, though, and it seems to be the same. So it doesn't matter if it was a good war or a bad war. The epidemics of PTSD and suicide are really are something that's constant in warfare. And we know this as well, too. If you looking back through history, you can go back as far as the Greeks and the Romans and find evidence of this. And I just want to say with the World War II veterans, the last study I know of that really looked at it, except for the VA data, which continues to show elevated suicide rates for World War II veterans, was out in California. They did a study in 2010. And, most of those guys are in their late 80s, 90s now. But they're still killing themselves at rates 4 times higher than their civilian counterparts.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and not compared to, and that's compared to, again, people of their same age and sex, right? So, I mean, you're getting a real apples to apples comparison. And yeah, so it doesn't matter that the wars were good or bad wars. The fact is that the trauma of those wars, what you've taken part in, even if you were in something so, good as defeating Imperial Japan or defeating Nazi Germany, those ghosts of the war stay with you forever. And that moral injury is something that, if you're not getting professional help for and you're not dealing with, is something that it's so difficult. It's so distressing that the only relief is putting, a pistol in your mouth.
Very good. Well, last question here. I wanted to get this in because it comes from Gary's widow, and something I understand, and I know that you do. Now, you're a Marine. I've heard some people say there's no such thing as a former Marine. You're a Marine, or you're if you're a Marine, you're a Marine.
I can't do nearly as many pull-ups as I used to do, so I don't know about that.
But her point, Gary was part of a proud military tradition, family tradition. These guys are all tough guys. I'm telling you, so I know them. They're tough guys.
Yeah.
Machismo runs deep in this family. Does that play a role in PTSD, and particularly in getting treated and seeking help and advice?
Oh, it certainly does. It certainly does. I mean, just to get back to the moral injury with that, again, you think you're going to be the guy with the white hat on, and then after the war, you have doubts about that. Was I the guy wearing the black hat, and with the idea of, this manliness, this machismo, that's what, particularly for the combat arms of the Marine Corps and the Army, if you're going into Army infantry or Marine Corps infantry, you're trying to recruit kids that are, tough kids that want to fight, that are going to get all tattooed up and want to prove themselves. These are the kinds of guys, so as well as too, when you're in the military, you're taught to survive. You're taught to endure. You're taught to persevere. I remember having an instructor say to me in the Marine Corps, during my training that, look, we're making you miserable now so that you understand how to be miserable. So that when you're in combat and you're being, you're being miserable doesn't bother you, right? So that you can be freezing cold, wet, hot as anything. I mean, just hungry, exhausted, and you're still going to fulfill the mission put in front of you. And that doesn't leave you. That you come home and one, there's a stigma about mental illness anyway. Right. I mean, so everyone has to deal with that. But then two, you come back and you think it can't happen to me, or three, and then you don't want to admit that you're hurting. You don't want to be weak. You don't want to let others down. You don't want others to have to help you. All those kinds of things come into play in terms of men and women. It's not just men. It's also women too. I mean, we have a lot of tough ladies, in the U.S. military, tough female veterans. And, so yeah, you don't want to seek help. You don't want to, so it is, that's a huge factor in getting people in to seek treatment. I mean, it took me, I was suicidal for 4 years or so before it was only because the woman I was living with at the time forced me to go. And that's how a lot of guys get in there, particularly men, is because the women in their lives, whether it be moms or spouses or sisters or daughters, force them to get help. Because men, we just don't want to go to the doctor anyway. But then if you're a combat veteran, you're too tough to go to the doctor, particularly for mental health issues. So absolutely, and please pass on my condolences to Gary's family, please.
Well, I certainly will. I just listened to this, and thank God I was a couple of years too young to have to go to Vietnam. Although in my news reporting, I will say I kind of get a little understanding of what you're talking about because I was out on a lot of fatalities, car wrecks, shootings, the suicides that you would see the aftermath of and that type of thing. And I remember looking at that as a reporter, and it affects you. And I would think, well, this shouldn't affect me. I mean, I'm aware of this. I've seen this in movies. I've seen it in news reports. But when you experience it firsthand, there's something about it. I don't know what it is, but it has this ill effect on you. And then, like you say, the real determining factor is whether or not you bear responsibility for it, which I didn't as a reporter. So that's the big difference there. Well, I gotta take it out here, Matthew. I'm going to give you the last word, and maybe if you could just also touch upon if people are watching this, if they've got this issue in themselves or family members, they want to reach out, contact somebody. What's your advice?
Well, first of all, you need professional help. If you're listening to this and you're going through this, or if you've got a family or friend, they need professional help. There's no way you're going to do this through self-help. Absolutely not. I mean, everyone I know who's tried it has failed, and some have failed, right, in the ultimate way. So you have to get help. Look, the rate of suicide for veterans who are in veterans health care is much lower than for veterans who are not in veterans health care. So get to the VA. I know a lot of VAs aren't very good. I'm fortunate here in North Carolina. We have a very good VA in Durham, but you need to get the care you need. And also too, you just need to do all those things to keep yourself healthy. You need to get off the drugs and the alcohol. You need to eat correctly. You need to exercise, etc. But the first thing is to get in with a professional. There's also the Veterans Healthcare line or Veterans Crisis line. I usually have it. I don't have my wallet on me. I keep a card on me with the phone number. But just Google that. And I have called them a number of times. It is staffed by extremely well-trained, extremely compassionate people, many of whom have been in the situation that the people who are calling in are in. So call the Veterans Healthcare line. And then the other part for family members and everything is that PTSD is contagious. And that so you have to take care of yourselves as well. You have to be aware that, walking on eggshells, if you're living with somebody and you're walking on eggshells, that's going to give you PTSD as well. So you have to take care of yourself, and you can never allow it to cross over the line where you're talking about now you're receiving harm. You're on the end of anger. You're on the end of abuse. Like I said earlier about domestic violence, I briefly touched on it, but domestic violence is a very big problem within the veteran community. Rates of domestic violence are much higher among veteran households than among civilian households, to say. So yeah, just to sum that up, go to the VA, call the Veterans Crisis Line, be aware of what you're going through, and get the help you need. And it's not an easy process. I don't want to say it gets easier. It just gets different. But that type of difference is a better thing than what you're living with right now.
Outstanding. We've run way over time, but it's well worth it. And folks, I'm telling you, this is great work that this man is doing. That's Matthew Ho. I want to thank him again for coming on the podcast. Matt, can we reach out again at some point in the future?
Oh, absolutely, George. Thank you so much.
Folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. Matthew Ho, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any other issues or questions, feel free to message me. Reach out to those helplines that Matthew mentioned. And please, if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe to us there. Ring the notification bell so that you can find out about future podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and all of those various places where podcasts are seen and heard. But for right now, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's another podcast by George.